Okay, so now we're going to create our first TypeScript file. So we'll create a working folder somewhere on our system. So I've opened up a command prompt and I'm going to make a new directory called tsbeginners somewhere. I'm going to use my D drive. That's a place I commonly use. You might have somewhere else you'd like to do it. But anyway, make directory tsbeginners and enter. Okay, now cd into it, tsb. If I just press tab, it will fill in the rest of the characters for me, so that makes it a little easier. Now to open Visual Studio Code, so code space dot, and that opens Visual Studio Code with a welcome page in the tsbeginners folder. There. In that, we're going to create a new file, a JavaScript file, and we're going to call it foo.js. Okay, so that's the new file icon, foo.js, and inside that, copy this file. So you can just use that icon there to copy all that text and paste. And if you do Shift Alt F, it'll reformat it nicer. Okay, now this is just JavaScript. Okay, so we can actually execute that JavaScript using Node.js. So if you open up a terminal, so there's a terminal option there, new terminal, or you can use that key combination. And down here, it's opened up a PowerShell. So when I'm in VSCode, I tend to use PowerShell, but you could use something else such as a command prompt or git bash if you have git installed. But I'm just going to go with the default, which is PowerShell. And if I just type node and then point to foo.js, actually what I just did then was I just typed the word foo and then pressed tab, and it found the file and filled in the correct path notation for me. So now if I just press enter, and it outputs hello ABC. If I just look at that better, there's a method, foo wants a parameter called bar, and it just prints hello bar. So here, create a constant called baz. It's a string ABC, and I call that method with baz, which is ABC. Comes up here and just prints out hello ABC like down there. So that's pretty straightforward. You've probably seen JavaScript before. Now, what we're going to do is instead of writing JavaScript manually like that, we're going to write TypeScript. Then the TSC compiler is going to convert that to JavaScript for us. So here we use the TS extension. So I'll rename that file in a moment to be foo.ts, and then we'll run it to the TypeScript compiler. And depending on where we want to use that, whether it's in the browser or Node.js, we have options to target the version of JavaScript. So for example, I could use ES6 compatible JavaScript in the web browser, and that's pretty common. Or I could use ES 2022 compatible JavaScript for when I want to run it in Node.js. Okay, so more about this in a second. This is why we're using TypeScript, because we're going to be writing TypeScript code, then using that tool to convert it to JavaScript. Okay, so also we can't run TypeScript directly in the browser or in Node. That's why we need to convert it to JavaScript first. Okay, so let's rename foo.js to foo.ts. So here, rename that to foo.ts. And now that is a TypeScript file. It still is actually JavaScript. TypeScript is a subset of JavaScript. But now that we're writing TypeScript, we have the option to explicitly set the types of variables, which I'll show you in the next videos. And we can also just write plain JavaScript in a TypeScript file. By default, it's going to allow this, even though it is showing me some warning there, which I'll fix up in the next video. But it doesn't really matter. This will still go through the TypeScript compiler and output a JavaScript version for us of this code. So what we're going to use is this line here, tsc command foo.ts. And remember, I'm using dot command because I'm using PowerShell. Okay, so copy that. Then in here, right click and it'll paste. Remember, if I was using the command prompt, I could just actually write that. But since I'm using PowerShell, I should add this dot command here to the command. So it's going to read foo.ts and convert that to a JavaScript version of the code, even though that is already actually valid JavaScript. So let's enter that. Okay, so it's created a new file, foo.js, and it's pretty much identical, except it's removed some white space. It's also renamed our consts to var. It's decided to use a function instead of an arrow function. It's used var down there as well, and it's put these semicolons at the end. What TSC just then was by default produced ES5 compatible code. So as JavaScript has been developed through the years, they add new things and they label it as an ES and a number. For example, this website down here in the JS versions is quite useful. We can see here that TSC just produced ES5 compatible code. So we can use any of these things. But the TypeScript I actually converted from is actually ES6 compatible. So I had let and const in there, for example. So if you look at this again, my TypeScript actually has a const. I don't have a let in it. Also, another thing, this red squiggly here, it's showing an error. This is only an error because I have foo.js also open in the IDE. Now when it's closed, it's okay. normally you don't output your JavaScript version to the same folder as your TypeScript. So you'll have a source folder and a distribution folder where it'll be output to. I'm not going to make a complicated boilerplate in this lesson that will automatically do this for us. But if you do my more advanced courses on Socket.io or 3JS, I do create more advanced boilerplates in either Vite or Webpack if you're interested in a more sophisticated TypeScript setup. But right now I'm just doing it as basic as I can. But anyway, back to this. TSC will output ES5 compatible code by default. Now we can run ES5 code in the browser and also on Node.js. So there's really nothing extra we have to do. But if you wanted to, we can add a target option. So we're going to recompile foo.ts, but I'm going to use target ES6. Okay, so press enter. Now the JavaScript that was output conforms to the ES6 standard, which supports the const keyword and also arrow functions. So I'll just compare that to ES5 again and we'll see what happens. You can see how it changed. It's now var and it's now function. Now, other options we have, for example, ES 2022, which is quite modern, and that pretty much looks identical to ES6 in this case. This is a very small project. There really isn't much conversion that needs to go on. But note that when you write TypeScript, you're able to use very advanced JavaScript in your code. And when you compile, it will get that code and try to make it compatible to whatever target you've selected. And the default is ES5. Now, also, when we look at the naming, it used to be names ES1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that. They've now switched to naming using the years. So ES 2015, ES 2016, ES 2022 was the one I just demonstrated. There's actually several. There is 2023. Well, there isn't 2023, but it says here, these are our options here, 2022 or ES Next is quite experimental. So avoid using that unless you really want to see what happens. Okay, but in this small project, it's still actually outputting ES6 compatible code. I'm just going to be happy with ES5, doesn't matter. See, the JavaScript comes out as something that's still going to work anyway in a browser and Node.js, but the TypeScript, the code we actually edit, gets all the extra features of modern JavaScript, plus we'll get the features of TypeScript, which I'll start to introduce in the next video. Okay. Now, also the naming of these variables here, foo, bar, baz, they don't actually mean anything. They're just common variables that you'll see on the internet. They are called metasyntactic variables. I've written about it down here, metasyntactic variables. Examples are foobar, foo, bar, baz, cux, however you pronounce these other words, cord, gralt, garply, waldo, fred, plug, something, and thud. So you'll see me using those throughout the examples. They don't actually mean anything. They're just good to use when you want to just teach a concept. Anyway, that works. This is only a very small project, so when we use a different target, we don't really see a lot of difference, but in a very large project, you would experiment with that. And also just remember too that having both these open in the IDE at the same time will actually confuse it a little bit, because normally you don't output your JavaScript to the same folder as your TypeScripts. You'll output it to a different folder. But I teach those things in my more advanced TypeScript courses if you're interested. Excellent. Let's continue.